The cafeteria was loud. Metal trays, boots on concrete, nervous laughter. That's when the gang noticed her. She was smaller than most. Head down. Moving fast, like she knew the rules. Don't look, don't talk, don't exist. The bully stepped into her path and smiled. "Where you rushing to?" he said, knocking the tray from her hands. Food splattered across the floor. She tried to back away. He grabbed her arm. The room froze for a heartbeat, then erupted. Shouts, chairs scraping, someone laughing too loud. She screamed. By the time the guards pushed through the crowd, batons raised, orders barking, it was already too late. They pulled the bully off her, dragged him back. But the damage had been done, because as the guards looked down at the woman on the floor, they realized something was wrong. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was staring straight ahead, calm, focused, like someone who had just decided she would never be a victim again. And what happened after the guards walked away would make the entire prison regret being late by just a few seconds. Stay with me until the end, because what this woman does next will force everyone in that prison to face the cost of looking away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. My name is Marcus, and I've been covering prison stories for 8 years now. I've interviewed hundreds of inmates, guards, and administrators. But this story, the one I'm about to tell you, changed how I think about survival, justice, and what happens when the system fails at the worst possible moment. Let me give you some context first, because context matters when you're about to witness what happens when someone reaches their breaking point. Federal Correctional Institution Riverside was not your typical women's facility. Built in 1987, it housed over 2,400 inmates across 4 separate housing units. The place had a reputation, and not the good kind. Violence was common. Overcrowding was chronic, and the staff turnover rate was so high that new guards were often thrown into situations they had no business handling. The woman in our story was named Keisha Williams, 32 years old, serving 18 months for financial fraud. First-time offender, college-educated. She had worked as an accountant before her conviction, lived in a suburban neighborhood, coached her daughter's soccer team on weekends. Prison was a foreign world to her, and it showed. Keisha had been at Riverside for exactly 43 days when this incident occurred. 43 days of keeping her head down, following every rule, avoiding every possible conflict. She ate alone, worked her assigned job in the laundry without complaint, and spent her free time reading in her cell. She was what guards called a ghost, an inmate who tried to become invisible. The gang that targeted her was called the Riverside Sisters. Don't let the name fool you. There was nothing sisterly about them. Led by a woman named Carmen Vasquez, they controlled most of the contraband trade in the facility. Drugs, cell phones, protection services, you name it. Carmen was serving life without parole for multiple homicides. She had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The Riverside Sisters had a system. They identified vulnerable inmates, usually first-timers or anyone who seemed different, and they made their lives hell until those inmates either joined up, paid protection money, or transferred out. It was business, cold and calculated. And Keisha Williams, with her quiet demeanor and obvious fear, had painted a target on her back from day one. But here's what nobody understood about Keisha. Not the guards, not the other inmates, not even Carmen herself. Keisha Williams had grown up in East Cleveland, in a neighborhood where survival meant learning to fight before you learned to walk. Her college education and suburban life weren't signs of weakness. They were proof of how far she had climbed. And when you've clawed your way out of one hell, you develop skills that don't just disappear because you're wearing a different kind of uniform. The incident in the cafeteria wasn't random. It was planned. Carmen had been watching Keisha for weeks, studying her routines, waiting for the perfect moment to make an example out of her. The lunch period in Block C was always chaotic. Guards were spread thin. Cameras had blind spots. And with over 300 inmates packed into a space designed for half that number, violence could erupt and disappear in seconds. Carmen's crew consisted of 5 women, each with their own specialty. There was Maria Santos, the enforcer, built like a linebacker and twice as mean. Jennifer Cole, the lookout, who could spot trouble from 3 tables away. Ashley Brown, the distraction artist, who could create chaos on command. Rebecca Martinez, the cleaner, who made evidence disappear. And Carmen herself, the orchestrator, who never got her hands dirty, but always got her way. They had chosen their spot carefully. Table 14, right in the center of the cafeteria, where everyone could see but the guards couldn't respond quickly. The plan was simple: humiliate Keisha publicly, establish dominance, and send a message to every other potential victim in the facility. It was supposed to be routine, business as usual. But as the saying goes, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. The confrontation started exactly as Carmen had scripted. Maria stepped into Keisha's path, forcing her to stop. The food tray hit the floor with a crash that echoed through the cafeteria. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. The audience was in place. "Oops," Maria said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Looks like someone made a mess." Keisha bent down to clean up the spilled food. Standard victim behavior. Carmen smiled. This was going exactly according to plan. "Don't bother," Maria continued, grabbing Keisha's arm and yanking her upright. "That's what the janitors are for. You got somewhere more important to be?" The room was watching now. Over 300 inmates, guards scattered around the perimeter, security cameras recording every second. This was Carmen's stage, and she was about to deliver a performance that would cement her reputation for months to come. But something in Keisha's eyes had changed. The fear was still there, but it was different now. Sharper, more focused, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside her mind. "I asked you a question," Maria pressed, tightening her grip on Keisha's arm. "You think you're too good to answer?" That's when Keisha spoke. Her voice was quiet, steady, almost conversational. "Let go of my arm," Maria laughed. "Or what, college girl? You gonna file a complaint?" The crowd was getting restless now. Voices rising, some inmates backing away, others pressing closer. The energy in the room was building towards something explosive, and everyone could feel it. Guard Patterson, stationed near the north entrance, noticed the commotion but hesitated. Interventions in the cafeteria were tricky. Move too fast and you could escalate a minor dispute into a full-scale riot. Move too slow and someone gets hurt. He reached for his radio, calling for backup, but kept his distance. That hesitation would haunt him for years. Maria's grip tightened. Keisha winced but didn't pull away. Around them, the circle of inmates was growing larger, voices getting louder. Carmen stepped forward, ready to deliver the killing blow to Keisha's reputation. "Here's how this works," Carmen said, her voice carrying across the cafeteria. "You're new, so I'll explain it once. You pay $20 a week for protection, or things get uncomfortable. Real uncomfortable." Keisha looked at Carmen, then at Maria, then at the crowd of faces surrounding her. For a moment, she seemed to be calculating something in her head. The old Keisha, the accountant from suburbia, would have paid, would have become another victim in Carmen's empire. But the woman standing in that cafeteria wasn't just an accountant anymore. She was someone who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. $20. Keisha repeated slowly, like she was processing a particularly complex equation. "Every week." Carmen nodded, satisfied. This was how it always went. The new fish would balk at first, maybe try to negotiate, but they always paid in the end. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Keisha Williams looked plenty afraid. "That's right. Think of it as insurance. Bad things happen to people who don't have insurance." The crowd pressed closer. Someone was recording with a smuggled phone, probably planning to sell the footage later. Violence was currency in here, and public humiliation was worth its weight in commissary credits. But Keisha's next words cut. through the noise like a blade. "I've got a better idea." Maria's grip loosened slightly. Carmen's confident smile wavered. This wasn't following the script anymore. "How about you let go of me right now? Walk away, and we pretend this never happened." Keisha's voice carried something that made several inmates in the front row take a step back. Authority. The kind that comes from places darker than any prison cell. Carmen recovered quickly. She hadn't built her empire by backing down from challenges, especially not from some scared accountant who thought a college degree made her untouchable. "Maria," she said quietly, "show her what happens to people who don't understand how things work in here." That was Maria's cue. She had done this dance dozens of times before. A quick backhand to establish dominance, maybe a knee to the stomach if the victim was particularly stubborn. Nothing that would bring serious heat from the administration, but enough to break someone's spirit. Permanently. Maria drew her hand back, aiming for Keisha's face. The crowd held its breath. Guard Patterson was still 20 feet away, pushing through the mass of bodies, shouting orders that nobody was listening to. The slap never landed. Keisha moved with precision that spoke of years of training, not the desperate flailing of someone learning to fight in prison. She caught Maria's wrist mid-swing, twisted it in a direction wrists weren't meant to go, and drove her elbow into Maria's solar plexus with surgical accuracy. Maria dropped like a sack of concrete, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The sound she made wasn't quite human, more like a deflating balloon mixed with genuine terror. The cafeteria went dead silent. 300 inmates, 5 gang members, and half a dozen guards all staring at the same impossible sight. Maria Santos, the woman who had hospitalized 12 people in the past year, was curled up on the floor, clutching her ribs and wheezing like a broken accordion. Carmen's brain struggled to process what she was seeing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Maria was unstoppable. Maria was fear incarnate. Maria was currently making sounds like a wounded animal while some suburban accountant stood over her without breaking a sweat. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered behind them. Keisha looked down at Maria with the same expression she might have worn while reviewing a particularly disappointing quarterly report. Clinical. Disappointed. Thoroughly unimpressed. "I told you to let go," she said simply. Jennifer Cole, the lookout, made the mistake of stepping forward. Not to fight, just to help Maria to her feet, but Keisha's head snapped toward her with predatory focus. "I wouldn't," Keisha said, "unless you want to join her." Jennifer froze mid-step. Something in Keisha's tone suggested this wasn't a bluff. Guard Patterson finally reached the inner circle, baton drawn, radio crackling with backup requests. But he stopped short when he saw the scene. Maria on the ground, clearly injured but conscious. Keisha standing calmly with her hands at her sides. No blood, no weapons, no obvious signs of the kind of violence that usually required medical intervention. "What happened here?" Patterson demanded, though his voice lacked the authority it usually carried. He had seen plenty of prison fights, but this felt different. Controlled, professional. "Accident," Carmen said quickly, her mind already working damage control. Maria slipped, hit her head on the table. Patterson looked skeptical, but the story was plausible enough. Prison accidents happened. People got hurt. As long as nobody was dead and the situation was contained, paperwork was easier than investigations. "Everyone back to your tables," he ordered. "Show's over." The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly. They had witnessed something unprecedented, and nobody wanted to miss the aftermath. But guards were arriving from other sections now, and staying meant questions nobody wanted to answer. Carmen helped Maria to her feet. The enforcer was breathing normally again, but her face was pale, and her eyes kept darting to Keisha with something that looked suspiciously like respect mixed with fear. "This isn't over," Carmen said quietly, meant for Keisha's ears only. Keisha picked up a plastic fork from the scattered remains of her lunch and examined it thoughtfully. "You're right," she said. "It's not." But the way she said it made Carmen wonder if she had just made a very serious miscalculation. As the cafeteria slowly returned to normal, inmates whispering in hushed tones and guards filing incident reports that would never reflect what really happened, Keisha Williams sat alone at an empty table and opened a book. To anyone watching, she looked like the same quiet, harmless woman who had walked into the facility 43 days earlier. They couldn't have been more wrong, because what nobody understood yet was that Keisha Williams hadn't just defended herself in that cafeteria. She had sent a message that would ripple through every housing unit, every gang territory, every power structure in the facility. The message was simple: the rules had just changed. And by lights out that night, everyone from the newest fish to the oldest lifers would know that there was someone new in the game. Someone who fought with a precision that spoke of training far beyond anything the prison system had ever seen. Someone who could take down a seasoned enforcer without breaking a sweat or raising her voice. Carmen Vasquez had built her empire on fear and reputation. But reputations, as she was about to learn, could be destroyed in seconds by someone who understood that true power came not from being the loudest person in the room, but from being the most dangerous one. The next morning brought something that hadn't been seen at Riverside in years: silence. Not the usual tense quiet that came before explosions of violence, but something different, respectful, almost reverent. Word had spread through the housing units like wildfire. The accountant from suburbia had put Maria Santos on the ground with moves that looked like they came from a military manual. Inmates who had missed the cafeteria incident were getting second-hand accounts that grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core facts remained the same. Someone had just rewritten the playbook on how power worked in this place. Keisha Williams walked to breakfast like nothing had changed. Same measured pace, same quiet demeanor, same book tucked under her arm, but the reactions around her told a different story entirely. Conversation stopped when she passed. Inmates stepped aside without being asked. Even the guards seemed to watch her differently, like they were seeing her for the first time and trying to figure out what they had missed. Carmen Vasquez sat with her remaining crew at table 14, the same spot where yesterday's incident had unfolded. Maria was there too, moving gingerly and avoiding eye contact with anyone who looked her way. The hierarchy that had seemed unshakable 24 hours earlier suddenly felt fragile. But Carmen hadn't survived 15 years in maximum security by backing down from challenges. If anything, what happened in the cafeteria had only strengthened her resolve. Nobody, especially not some first-time offender with a college degree, was going to destroy what she had built. The problem was figuring out how to respond. Direct confrontation was out of the question after what happened to Maria. Keisha had demonstrated skills that none of them possessed, and Carmen was smart enough to recognize when she was outmatched physically. But there were other ways to break someone in prison. Subtler ways. More permanent ways. That morning, as Keisha sat alone reading her book, Carmen began making phone calls. Not the kind that showed up on official prison records, but the underground network that connected inmates across facilities, gang members on the outside, and corrupt staff members who could be bought for the right price. By noon, Carmen had learned something that changed everything. Keisha Williams wasn't just some accountant who had gotten lucky in a fight. She was former military, special operations, the kind of training that turned ordinary people into weapons, the kind of background that should have been flagged during intake processing, but somehow slipped through the cracks. The revelation should have made Carmen back off. Any reasonable person would have cut their losses and found easier targets. But Carmen Vasquez had never been accused of being reasonable. If anything, learning about Keisha's military background only made her more dangerous in Carmen's eyes. Someone with that kind of training could dismantle everything Carmen had built if given enough time. So Carmen made a decision that would prove to be the biggest mistake of her criminal career. She decided to escalate. The first move came during afternoon recreation period. Ashley Brown, the distraction artist, approached Keisha while she was walking the exercise yard. Nothing threatening, just a casual conversation that seemed innocent enough to anyone watching. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday," Ashley said, falling into step beside Keisha. Keisha didn't respond. She kept walking, eyes forward, maintaining the same steady pace she had used since arriving at Riverside. "Must have been scary," Ashley continued. "Your first real prison fight, but you handled it well. Real well." Still no response. But Ashley could see Keisha's jaw tighten slightly. A small tell that suggested she was listening even if she wasn't engaging. "Thing is," Ashley said, lowering her voice, "fights like that have consequences. People get hurt feelings, people hold grudges. And in here, grudges have a way of spreading." This time, Keisha stopped walking. She turned to face Ashley with the same clinical expression she had worn in the cafeteria, like she was studying a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. "Are you threatening me?" Keisha asked. Her voice was conversational, almost curious, but there was something underneath it that made Ashley's survival instincts start screaming warnings. "Not threatening," Ashley said quickly. "Just explaining how things work. Carmen's got friends, lots of friends. In here, on the outside, even among the staff. Sometimes accidents happen to people who make waves." Keisha nodded thoughtfully, like she was considering a reasonable business proposition. "Accidents," she repeated. "That's right. Slips in the shower, food poisoning from the kitchen, cell doors that don't lock properly at night. You understand?" For a moment, Keisha was quiet. Around them, other inmates continued their recreation routines, but several had noticed the conversation and were watching from a distance. Word would spread that Carmen's crew was making their next move. The question was how the accountant would respond. "I do understand," Keisha said finally. "Better than you might think." Something in her tone made Ashley realize she might have made a serious error in judgment. This wasn't going according to plan. Keisha was supposed to be intimidated, maybe offer to negotiate, certainly show some sign of fear. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in the conversation, like Ashley was sharing useful information rather than delivering threats. "See, where I come from," Keisha continued, "we had a saying about accidents. They tend to happen to people who spend too much time planning them." Ashley felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you don't," Keisha said. "But you will." The conversation ended there. Keisha resumed her walk, leaving Ashley standing alone in the yard trying to figure out what had just happened. She had delivered the message Carmen wanted. Delivered, but somehow it felt like she had lost the exchange completely. That night, Carmen called an emergency meeting with her crew. They gathered in the storage room behind the kitchen, a space they had claimed years earlier for sensitive discussions. Maria was still moving carefully, but her injuries weren't severe enough to keep her from planning revenge. "She's military," Carmen announced without preamble. "Special operations. The kind of training that makes our little enforcer here look like a kindergarten teacher." Maria's face darkened. "Nobody told me that before I stepped to her." "Because nobody knew," Carmen replied. "Her file says accounting background, first-time offender, low security risk. But I made some calls. Turns out our quiet little bookkeeper spent 8 years in the Army. Multiple deployments. Close quarters combat instructor." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They had challenged someone who was trained to kill people professionally. And they had done it in the most public way possible. Every inmate in the facility now knew that Carmen's crew had taken a shot at the new girl and lost. Their reputation was damaged, and in prison, reputation was everything. "So what do we do?" Jennifer asked. Carmen had been thinking about that question all day. The smart move would be to let it go. Maybe even approach Keisha about some kind of truce. But smart moves didn't maintain power in maximum security. Fear did. Respect did. And both of those required demonstrations of strength, not negotiations that made you look weak. "We make her disappear," Carmen said simply. The room got even quieter. Making someone disappear in prison was serious business. It meant calling in favors, spending significant resources, and accepting the kind of heat that came with administrative investigations. It wasn't something you did lightly. "You sure about this?" Rebecca asked. "Heat's gonna be intense if something happens to her so soon after the cafeteria thing." Carmen had considered that angle. The timing was problematic, but waiting would only make Keisha more dangerous. Every day she remained untouchable was another day other inmates might start getting ideas about challenging established authority. Better to deal with the heat than let this spread, Carmen decided. "We move tonight." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rebecca would create a distraction in the East Wing, drawing guards away from the housing units. Jennifer would disable the security camera in corridor C7 using a technique they had perfected months earlier. Ashley would ensure Keisha's cellmate was elsewhere during the crucial window, and Maria, despite her injuries, would handle the actual elimination, with help from 2 inmates Carmen was bringing in from outside her usual crew. It should have worked. Carmen had orchestrated similar operations before with flawless execution. The guards at Riverside were understaffed and overworked. Security systems were outdated and poorly maintained. And Keisha, despite her military background, was still just one person in a hostile environment, surrounded by potential enemies. But Carmen made a crucial error in her planning. She assumed that Keisha Williams was thinking like a prisoner, following prison logic, playing by prison rules. Keisha wasn't thinking like a prisoner at all. She was thinking like a soldier in enemy territory. And soldiers in enemy territory didn't wait for the enemy to make the first move. At 11:30 that night, 30 minutes before Carmen's crew was scheduled to begin their operation, something happened that would force every gang leader in the facility to completely reassess how they approached conflict resolution. The lights went out in Housing Unit C, not just the main corridor lights, but every electrical system in the entire section. Emergency lighting failed to activate. Communication systems went dead. Even the electronic locks on the cell doors stopped functioning. In the complete darkness that followed, sounds echoed through the corridors that would haunt the guards who eventually responded. Not screaming, not fighting, but something far more unsettling. The sound of someone moving through the darkness with absolute confidence, while others stumbled and panicked. When backup power finally restored basic lighting 20 minutes later, guards found Carmen Vasquez and her entire crew unconscious in various locations throughout the housing unit. Not injured in any obvious way, just unconscious, as if they had all decided to take a nap at exactly the same time. Medical examination would later reveal that each of them had been subjected to what the prison doctor described as precisely applied pressure to specific nerve clusters, techniques that required anatomical knowledge and physical skills far beyond what any typical inmate possessed. Security footage from other sections of the prison showed that during the blackout, Keisha Williams had never left her cell. Her door remained locked, her bunk remained occupied, and infrared sensors confirmed her presence throughout the entire incident. The official report would conclude that the blackout had been caused by a maintenance issue with the electrical grid, and that Carmen's crew had suffered injuries during the confusion that followed. Case closed. No further investigation required. But everyone in the facility understood what had really happened. Someone had just demonstrated that gang politics, protection rackets, and territorial disputes were quaint concepts from an earlier era. The new era belonged to people who understood that real power came not from building empires, but from dismantling them so efficiently that nobody could prove you had been involved. Carmen Vasquez spent the next 3 days in medical isolation, not because of her injuries, but because she couldn't stop shaking long enough to convince the staff she was mentally stable. When she finally returned to general population, she was a different person entirely. Quiet, respectful, extremely careful about which tables she chose during mealtimes. The Riverside Sisters disbanded without any formal announcement. Members simply drifted away, finding new crews or choosing to serve their remaining sentences as quietly as possible. The protection racket that had dominated the facility for years disappeared overnight, and Keisha Williams continued reading her books, working her laundry detail, and counting down the days until her release. But now she did it in a facility where everyone understood that some people were best left alone. The guards never figured out how she had done it. The administration never officially acknowledged that anything unusual had happened. But the message had been received by everyone who mattered. There were rules, and then there were people who wrote the rules. The aftermath of that night changed everything at Riverside, but not in the way anyone expected. When word spread about what happened to Carmen's crew, it didn't create chaos or power struggles. Instead, it created something far more unsettling for the administration: order. Inmates began following rules they had ignored for years. Contraband trafficking slowed to a crawl. Violence dropped by 70% in the following month. The facility that had been a powder keg for decades suddenly became what the warden described in his reports as surprisingly manageable. But the guards knew better. This wasn't peace through rehabilitation or improved conditions. This was peace through fear. The kind of fear that comes from understanding that someone among them operated on a completely different level than anything they had encountered before. Officer Patterson, the guard who had been too slow to prevent the cafeteria incident, found himself studying Keisha during his shifts. She maintained the same routines, followed the same schedule, showed the same quiet compliance she had displayed since arrival. But now he noticed details that had escaped his attention before. The way she positioned herself to always have clear sight lines to exits, how she never sat with her back to open spaces, the fact that she could identify approaching footsteps from remarkable distances without looking up from her reading. These weren't the habits of an accountant from suburbia. These were the reflexes of someone who had spent years in places where situational awareness meant survival. Patterson had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before taking the prison job. He recognized the signs because he carried some of them himself, but his military bearing was obvious, developed through formal training and reinforced by unit cohesion. Keisha's was different, deeper, more instinctive, the kind that came from operations where backup wasn't coming and mistakes weren't survivable. 3 weeks after the blackout incident, Patterson made a decision that would cost him his job, but probably saved his life. He approached Keisha during evening recreation with a question that had been eating at him. "What unit were you with?" he asked quietly, standing just outside her normal walking path. Keisha stopped and looked at him with that same clinical assessment she had given Ashley in the yard. For a moment, Patterson thought she might not answer. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, the kind that doesn't exist in official records. Patterson felt his blood run cold. He had heard rumors about those units during his deployment, special operations groups that worked in the spaces between legal and necessary, people who solved problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means, the kind of operators who learned to disappear completely when their usefulness ended. "How did you end up here?" he asked. Keisha resumed walking, and Patterson fell into step beside her. Around them, other inmates maintained careful distance, creating a bubble of space that moved with them across the yard. "Same way everyone else does," she said. "Made choices, faced consequences. But your charges were financial fraud, white-collar crime. Sometimes the mission requires different skill sets," Keisha replied. "Sometimes accountants need to be more than accountants." Patterson never spoke of that conversation to anyone. 3 months later, he quietly transferred to a different facility, citing personal reasons. But before he left, he made sure to note in Keisha's file that she was a model prisoner who should be considered for early release programs. Keisha Williams served her full 18 months without another incident. No fights, no disciplinary actions, no trouble of any kind. She read her books, worked her shifts, and counted down the days until her release like any other inmate preparing to rejoin society. But everyone at Riverside understood the truth. The system hadn't reformed Keisha Williams. Keisha Williams had reformed the system simply by existing within it and demonstrating what real power looked like when it chose to remain invisible. On her release day, Carmen Vasquez watched from the window of her housing unit as Keisha walked toward the exit gates. The former gang leader had lost 40 pounds during her remaining sentence, mostly from stress-induced insomnia. She had learned to sleep with one eye open, never quite shaking the feeling that shadows moved differently when certain people were nearby. As Keisha disappeared through the prison gates, carrying nothing but a small bag of personal belongings, Carmen whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever deity protected fools from the consequences of their own stupidity. She had challenged someone who operated by rules she couldn't understand, in a game she hadn't known she was playing, and somehow survived the experience. The guards stopped the fight too late that day in the cafeteria, but what they really failed to stop was the moment when everyone realized that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who never wanted to fight in the first place. Because when you finally push them too far, they don't just fight back. They rewrite the entire game.